almost as select as we are tonight. The oldest student-run organisation in the world, half a millennium old, is the St Andrew's Theological Society, where, in 1976, I was asked to address its annual dinner. The privilege put me on my mettle, for while the committee has to be students, the membership includes established academics, many with great, even global reputations. Also, my student predecessors with whom I'd overlapped, I knew had been capable. So they subsequently proved, becoming the Cadbury Professor at Birmingham, Professor at Aberdeen, Moderator of the Church of Scotland, President of Princeton, and the late Bishop of Brecon. All of them Fellows of the British Academy, by the way. Well, apart, understandably, from the late Bishop. In fact, salutary to think, but in conventional terms, I'm probably the least distinguished person ever to have given the address there in half a millennium, which might, in a way, be apt. For while we were chatting over the meal, the man then widely acknowledged as the doyen of biblical scholars, Matthew Black, surprised me by how strongly he insisted that ivory towers aren't necessarily healthy for one's theological perspective. As a case in point, hear what Francis Burkitt, Cambridge professor a century ago, wrote about today's reading. It's quite inconceivable that the historical Jesus could have argued and quibbled with opponents as he is represented to have done in the fourth gospel. There is an argumentativeness, a tendency to mystification about the utterances of the Johannine Christ, which, taken as the report of actual words, is positively repellent. The only possible explanation is this: the work is not history, but something else cast in historical form. Burkitt's suggestion was that these couldn't be events, only a conflict of ideas written up something like a drama. Whatever he found unpalatable, repellent, he attributed not to Jesus, but to the gospel writer engaging in what we might today call faction. The civil Edwardian gentleman in him just simply couldn't credit that Jesus and the religious leaders rowed, so openly and crudely rowed, in the temple environs too. Burkitt was wrong, of course, for reasons I'll give in a moment. However, two things should be said in mitigation of him, and hopefully they'll explain why I've mentioned him at all. First, in mitigation, my guess is it's a majority in England now, including an awfully high proportion in schools and churches and church schools, who would be incredulous today, incredulous, shocked, offended, censorious, if reminded of the fact, perfectly plain on paper, that Jesus was unique, was very definitely divisive, and that he intended to be. Second, and in fairness, I must add that Burkitt learned better. People like Israel Adams, a leading Jewish authority, confirmed that the issues disputed over in John's account were typical and topical in first century Judaism. So much so that we needn't doubt that the story has a historical base. And then Albert Schweitzer convinced fellow theologians that they'd much underestimated how central in Jesus' thinking was eschatology. That's those dark issues concerned with the last things. Eschatos is last in Greek. The last things: death, resurrection, judgment, afterlife. So, in the 1920s, after the First World War shredded Edwardian optimism once and for all, Burkitt's position shifted to accepting the last things had been among Jesus' priorities. Indeed, he went further. There'd been plenty of other Jews in the first century for whom eschatology figured highly, and they often articulated it with vividly bold images of catastrophes and supernatural intervention. What Burkitt came to see was that Jesus hadn't just talked about last things. Uniquely, he tied them to himself. He saw himself as the key to them, the sole key. Once we're alert to that pattern, Jesus as the key to death, resurrection, judgment, afterlife, and saying that those things are determined by our attitudes to him, then parts of today's passage and the whole chapter leading up to it, parts Burkitt previously balked at, previously dismissed as repellent mystification, they'll then fall into place and begin to make sense. Our reading starts at verse 48, with the row already far advanced. Unfortunately, Alex read it to us in such a mellifluous voice that you probably didn't realize what a row it is. Read the chapter for yourself. The row's far advanced, flashpoint approaching. It begins, our reading begins, with retorts to points and compressions of points spelt out already in earlier bruising exchanges. It sounds like a slagging match. But these aren't scurrilous jibes. For Jesus and the Pharisees both, these were the most absolutely serious issues, literally damning accusations. And notice, too, how similar the accusations on both sides are. Jesus, it's suggested, is a Samaritan, a direct riposte to his having just denounced the Pharisees as no children of Abraham, rather the devil's spawn. Not that either criticism was meant to be taken in any genetic sense. It's all about something less crude and more important. Both sides, though, are saying the same thing, categorically denying that the other is a true Jew. Quite what constituted a true Jew, however, as Dr. Israel Abrahams reminded Professor Burkitt, was highly contentious. Have you noticed that Mark, our earliest gospel, opens with something so familiar, so frequently featured in the New Testament, that we easily forget how entirely foreign to the Old Testament it is, quite unknown there? Baptism. It's often assumed to be a New Testament equivalent to circumcision. But equivalence, of course, indicates rivalry. Remember, those seeking baptism from John the Baptist or from the other baptizing sects, or later from the early church, these people, almost all of them, were Jews, members already of the covenant by virtue of circumcision, but nevertheless feeling and fearing that that wasn't sufficient. Even among the Orthodox rabbis, it was a moot point whether baptism or circumcision should be taken as the sign of entry into Judaism. It was formally debated later in the century by Rabbi Joshua and Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, and the result was adjudged a draw. Because it was a draw, actually, rather like some sporting matches, the status quo was continued and circumcision kept the title. But the fact that it was argued and rated a draw shows just how close the contest was. On a general point, Jesus and most Pharisees agreed about this. Dissent and ritual weren't enough. A committed disposition towards God was vital. Evidently, though, on some subtler point there was disagreement, so profound as to cause them to castigate each other as demonic, outright obstructors and opponents of God. Against the charge that he's demon-possessed, Jesus' defense is he simply honors the Father, with the implication, articulated by him some minutes before, that anyone who genuinely knew the Father would readily recognize Jesus' honoring God and would love Jesus for it. His point, though, is not only defensive. The further implication, now spelt out, is that anyone rejecting Jesus thereby dishonours God. Such people, whatever they may say, are in effect rejecting God. Consequently, they bring judgment on themselves. Thus is our judgment determined by our judgment of Jesus. You see what Burkitt came to realize, how this one of the last four things is tied to Jesus, how he's key to it. So too with the other last things. Verily, verily, your translation was slightly different, but verily, verily, it's the same word twice. Verily, verily, I say to you, if anyone keep my word, he'll never see death. Now, it can't be mere dying that Jesus is talking about, since earlier he'd predicted his own dying, predicted that the Son of Man would be lifted up by the Jews, that they'd instigate his murder. He's talking of things beyond dying. It's not so obvious in English, but in the original Greek, it's conspicuous that Jesus doesn't use the normal words for never or see. His never has a strongly ongoing sense, suggestive of never ever ceasing. And his see is more like focus on, give attention to. The nuances are that anyone keeping Jesus' word, and what's that mean? Holding to his testimony that he and the Father are mutually witnesses of each other. Anyone keeping that word will continue going on, heedless of dying and death. And then, beyond dying, the same judgment we've made for ourselves now, our judgment on Jesus, will still continue to be determinative. Of course, Pharisees believed in resurrection and afterlife as well. Martyrdoms in the intertestamental period had fueled the conviction that God, if he were to be true to himself, couldn't let those cut off for his sake simply terminate when they died. His love and his justice would combine to continue their lives. Thus, on another occasion, when Jesus told Sadducees that even with respect to people centuries deceased, people like Abraham, God remains their God, remains a God of the living, not of the dead. On that occasion, the Pharisee bystanders applauded him. On this occasion, they're so scandalized they start to quibble. Despite sharing a belief in afterlife, they start saying, oh, but Abraham did die. Really, what they're saying is no more than a quibble, a rather desperate debating point. They themselves must have been aware of it, for after all, they believe themselves that resurrection presupposes dying. No, what they're really upset about, really riled about, wasn't that Jesus was affirming resurrection and afterlife. It's that he's appropriating those things, those last things, to himself. What the Pharisees looked for as the final fulfillment of God's love and justice, Jesus is declaring is mediated through him. And actually, they might have taken offense at something else. I said before that our translation had said verily only once. They may have been really offended by that. I say this because actually the words verily, verily are amen, amen. And no Jew spoke them like that. A Jew, in the same way that we might today, he would use amen liturgically to seal, to end a prayer, to commit it to God. Or he might say amen in response to someone else. Tottenham are the greatest football team in the world. Amen. No one on record ever said, amen, amen, I tell you now. It's absolutely unprecedented. It is unique. It would have been thought scandalous. But to return, exasperated, the Pharisees ask if he's making himself out to be greater than Abraham. And Jesus' reply is, he saw and rejoiced to see my day. A tradition had grown up that besides what's recorded in the Old Testament, Abraham was granted a special insight or vision. Whether insight or vision, actually, the difference might in this case be academic. After all, if it was an insight, it would have to be based on Abraham's experiences as we have them recorded. If it was a vision of the future, for him to know that it was genuine, it would have to be congruent with those same experiences. So let's not make too much of the distinction. But what we know is what some of the leading rabbis thought that this insight or vision amounted to. Rabbi Akiba, debating with Rabbi Johanan ben Zaki, held that Abraham had been shown not only this world, but the world to come. And that, Akiba stressed, would include the days of the Messiah. Yet Jesus is claiming here far more than that Abraham recognizes him as Messiah. What precipitates the Pharisees to pick up stones to lynch him there and then is his saying, "Before Abraham was, I am." He's appropriating, on top of everything else, the very name of God. Not merely a term for God or deity or divinity, such as El or Elohim, not merely a title, such as Most High, Almighty, King of Heaven, Lord of Hosts, or simply Lord, Adonai. Jesus is appropriating God's very name. And if we understand the name's nuances, we answer those questions which, up to now, you may have noticed, I've rather left hanging. At the burning bush, Moses asked God for his name. Bear in mind, Hebrews thought a person's name enclosed and disclosed the person's character, his essence, his mission. And God replied to Moses, "I am what I am," or we might render it, "I am who I am." In Hebrew, as originally written, that's 4 letters, the so-called tetragrammaton, the 4-letter word, YHVH, or following a more modern system of transliteration, YHWH. Most probably it was pronounced Yahweh. It's crucial to understand the name. Positively important, call on the name of the Lord and you will be saved. Negatively important, the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. What are the nuances? The tense is continuous, translatable equally well as I will be who I will be. Therefore, God is constant. Also, I am has in Hebrew an additional active implication of to be, to cause to be. Therefore, God is causal, is creator. Now, I am the one who is might suggest, if you were a Greek philosopher, a contrast between timeless, unchanging God and creatures always in flux. Between God seen as being itself and creatures dependent, contingent on him. That contrast was central to many Christian philosophers, Thomas Aquinas, or in the last 50 years, Jacques Maritain, Etienne Gilles, Eric Maskell in my own Anglican communion. There's a lot to be said for that. However, to the Hebrew mind, the relationship was much more dynamic, much more interactive, so that God isn't remote. He exercises will and purpose. He has plans for creation and his creatures. He is the one, in a phrase that the rabbis loved, he is a one who exists for Israel, for his people. Therefore, God is constructive. Give those characteristics full weight. He is constant, causal, creative, constructive, and it should bring us to the conclusion that all initiative is his, only his. So to know him isn't merely something cerebral. To know him is to rely on him. That's why calling on the name, understanding that name, is to be saved. Whereas conversely, invoking him while relying on something else is to take his name in vain. At bottom, we have to recognize his initiative. We have to let God be God. That was the subtle, vital difference at the core of Jesus' dispute with the Pharisees. To know God is to let God be God, to rely on him. That's what made a true Jew, a true child of God. But it entails trusting him to carry out his purposes, on his initiative, by his power. It entails not usurping him in any way, for he is a jealous God, and he wishes to do good, not for us to do it for him. In principle, the Pharisees knew all that, but in practice, they set up structures to do his work for him. Schools, rituals, laws, more laws, commentaries on laws, all meant to bolster the worship of God, to promote him. But they became burdens and barriers. Good things in themselves, they became idols, in effect. And the Pharisees building religion on them became too closely akin to building Babel. Their intentions were awfully good, and they led where good intentions lead. Jesus, by contrast, isn't this unique as well? Has almost no structures. Save what? Saying that we should remember him with bread and wine. Almost everything else for Jesus was secondary to simply relying on God and then trying to live lives that reflect that reliance. Would Abraham have recognized that in his vision or his insight? Think of some of the great defining moments in Abraham's life. He believed, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Abraham was not altogether a good man, but he believed, he relied on God, not on laws or commentaries or schools or anything else. And it was reckoned to him as righteousness, and that same promise was extended to any others who will accept it. The chosen people are the ones who let God choose them. If Abraham had seen Jesus, would he have recognized him from his own experience? We can't go through all the features of Abraham's life, but think of a few. He honors Melchizedek, a priest king of a city whose name is peace and who gives him bread and wine. Abraham may well have recognized Jesus. What else? When he realizes God might destroy Salem, he prays, "Shall the judge of all the world do right? Oh, if there's 50 good people, will you spare the city?" Yes. 40? Yes. If there's only 10? Yes. And of course, they couldn't even find 10. And when I was a child, this really frustrated me. I thought, why on earth didn't Abraham go on to say, what about one good man? Well, we know God would still have said, yes, God is constant. He would have given the same answer. Now that I'm an adult, I realize that perhaps the reason Abraham didn't go down to one good man in the city is there are no good men in the city. What else about Jesus might Abraham have recognized from his own experience? What's the other defining moment? He takes Isaac for sacrifice, and when asked, "Where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" says, "The Lord will provide." Would Abraham recognize that with no good men in the city, the Lord himself had to provide one? one caught in a thicket of crowns at his death. I think we shouldn't be too harsh on these Pharisees. After all, Christians are Pharisaic too. Our Christian institutions, ourselves as individuals, we will, I'm afraid, commit the same mistake. Again and again, we'll set up institutions, structures to do good. But at some point, we'll be using those structures and letting them get in the way, and we'll have to review them and turn back to God. I'll give you a very obvious example, not close to home. The Amish. 16th century, they split off from the churches in Switzerland and Holland because the formal churches, they think, are too tied up with the world, with the state. And so they emigrate to America and they set up their own rural communities separate from the world, or separate from the English, as some of them like to call the world. But what happened? They adopt a 17th century world in order to reject the present world. They say no to cars and keep to their horse and carts. But it ends up with so many laws and restrictions that you wonder if they didn't in the end put the cart before the horse. And what's more, the best of the Amish recognize the problem, that they may have constructed a legalism of their own. And the best of them will say, yes, but so long as what we do, we always remember to do for the love of God, not because it's Amish regulation. If it's for the love of God, that sanctifies it. And that is the truth. But we always, in our own lives, individually or as churches, have to keep reviewing to making sure that we are relying actually not on what we do, but on the one who is constant and who wishes to be active for us. And we will get it wrong, but that too isn't too much of a worry. One of the greatest of the Pharisees, a Pharisee of the Pharisees, got it very long and then learned that actually God would do it all for him. I like him. I'm named after him.